Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the first tremor began the moment Willow set her hand on the moral chessboard and pushed the opening piece toward darkness. After Drew survived and regained consciousness, the two of them formed a quiet accord that did not require words, only shared glances and the frictionless logic of desperation. Their plan was not a single stroke but a lattice of small, disciplined acts, calendar blocks arranged to create gaps where none existed, lists of tasks written in neutral language to hide intent, and a careful reading of procedural gray areas they believed could be exploited. Willow, haunted by the specter of losing her child, convinced herself that cornering Michael would reopen a door to peace. What began as a bedside understanding hardened into an apparatus. Drew would lean on fractured memory to erect a sequence of advantageous recollections. Willow would fuse witnesses, timestamps, and settings into a funnel that aimed suspicion at her former husband and kept it there long enough to break him. Drew's portion of the scheme lived in the margins of trauma. He studied the way people accept narratives about injury and recall, then designed an arc in increments. A stray image would surface on a Tuesday. A sensory echo metallic air, the taste of adrenaline will arrive on a Friday. The following week, a silhouette would resolve into a figure whose posture matched Michael's. These fragments would be spaced to feel organic, each one presented only after a plausible trigger. He practiced the transitions that made a false memory sound like an involuntary truth, cataloging the words doctors used when they described post-event clarity and the intervals detectives tended to accept before they grew impatient. To make the story do more than point, he layered motive into it by reviving older friction between the MENA board meeting dispute, a simmering grievance, a message taken out of context so that when his invented recognition finally named Michael, it would sit on a bed of prior plausibility rather than dangle in the air as a naked accusation. Willow's work unfolded like logistics for a controlled burn. She set about curating people and places, one by one, until the chain looked inevitable. Jacinda's availability became an anchor point around which Willow bent the night. She arranged calls that would ping cell towers in a deliberate pattern, calibrated to mislead any retrospective mapping of movement. She identified weak angles in cameras near a hotel corridor and a parking area where a rideshare pickup might obscure who got into which car. She studied hospital visitor logs to determine when a sympathetic nurse could be seen near a doorway at the precise minute Drew later claimed he remembered a detail, granting the memory a stage and a witness who did not know what she was witnessing. She even charted municipal traffic timings to anticipate delays that might distort how long an officer believed it would take to travel between two points, hoping to make Michael appear to be into places at once in a way that favored her narrative. The digital spine of the operation sat inside a simple folder that looked like leftovers from a school project. Within it lived a spreadsheet of time blocks with color codes for face planting, seating, recall, corroboration along with screenshots of messages clipped out of context to suggest heat where there had only been friction. Willow maintained a diagram of call flows with arrows indicating who should text whom and when to create the impression of spontaneity. A page of prompts guided Drew's posture, what to mention in passing to a nurse, what to omit with a detective to encourage a follow-up, how to let a small inconsistency slip so that a later correction seemed like progress rather than manipulation. Version numbers bloomed in the file names as they iterated and trimmed, each change time-stamped in the quiet hours when they believed no one would look. A cloud backup mirrored the folder with a forgettable label because Willow knew that paper burns and hardware fails, but mirrored data can be retrieved. They anticipated friction points and planned lubricants. If Dandy's instincts sharpened, Willow would introduce noise by steering Jacinda toward a volunteer shift that produced a paper trail of altruism, lending her credibility. If detectives triangulated a phone, Drew would have a delivery receipt ready to introduce an innocent reason for a detour. If Michael refused to engage, a social media hint, a half-formed comment about a contentious meeting would invite misinterpretation. The plan relied less on a single decisive blow and more on saturating the environment with misleading cues so that every investigative step found something that looked like confirmation. It was not sophisticated in the sense of espionage, it was sophisticated in the way bad weather is sophisticated, arriving in layers that seem harmless in isolation yet ruinous in some. Into this architecture of deceit stepped a child who knew only that adults speak one way when rooms are full and another when they think no one is listening. Scout had learned to grow around absences since Sam's death, shaping herself to spaces that grief leaves behind. She had become attuned to the small and guarded gestures of those who believed they were unseen, the hurried minimization of a screen, the second check to ensure a device was locked, the way voices flatten when they are building a story rather than telling one. On an afternoon that began like any other, she found a tablet left on a side table, its screen dimmed but not asleep, a tiny pulse of light betraying life beneath glass. There was no lock screen to hurdle, only a last open file that returned with a tap to an interface she recognized from her own homework. The folder names aspired to anonymity, numbers, dates, neutral nouns, yet familiarity bleeds her own edges when the content is personal. Scout saw the spreadsheet first, a neat grid of hours and initials she recognized. She scrolled and found messages captured as images, their top and bottom trimmed to remove context that would have softened them. A diagram labeled with arrows and initials made her uneasy without explaining itself. Another file contained guiding notes that referenced memory cues, rehearsed disclosures, and a name framed by verbs that did not belong near someone you loved. She did not understand chain of custody or evidentiary thresholds, but she understood names and dates, and the steady drum of intent made Michael look like the only answer. In each file, the same gravity pulled toward the same center. Fear presents as a fork. Silence and complicity on one side, action and uncertainty on the other. Scout chose the uncertain path with the clarity that sometimes only the young can afford. She copied the folder to a removable drive because the act felt tangible and safe, like pocketing a note that might otherwise be taken away. She disabled the tablet's wireless connection with a few quick swipes, guided by the simple instinct that secrets try to escape once they know they are under threat. She thought about who to tell and realized that the safest adult is often the one obligated by oath to listen. Then she went to the police station, not in a rush that would attract attention, but with a deliberate calm that made it easier to keep walking once the glass doors slid open. Procedures took over where courage handed off. The desk officer listened, recognized the edges of something serious in the language of files and timelines, and called for a detective. The contents were logged, and before anyone read substance, they read metadata. A technician imaged the drive, created hashes to preserve integrity, and made working copies so the original could be sealed. The timeline embedded in the documents told one story, the timestamps on the files told another. Creation times betrayed late-night activity framed by the plan as spontaneous morning insight. File paths reflected user accounts mapped to Willow's device. Cloud sync identifiers pointed to a mirrored repository where older drafts slept with unedited sentences that were far more revealing than the polished versions intended for eventual discovery. A familiar name appeared in the call flow diagram, and the same name surfaced in phone records pulled by Warrant a day later. From there, the cascade assumed its own logic. Investigators drew a map from cell tower data and matched it to the proposed sequence of recollections. Discrepancies arrived in clusters rather than as isolated mishaps. A ride-share receipt placed a participant across town during a supposed corridor rendezvous. A parking garage camera captured a license plate at a time when a different location had been implied. An attempt to shape a nurse's memory intersected with a medication scan that fixed the nurse in another wing. The very scaffolding meant to simplify blame became a net catching the hands that had woven it. Each point of false friction generated a burst of heat visible to anyone now looking with the benefit of Scout's initial spark. Private consequences arrived before public ones. Willow felt the plan unravel in physical symptoms long before she saw the paperwork. Sleep shortened to thin sheets of consciousness. The room settled at strange angles as adrenaline ebbed and left a raw, trembling clarity in its wake. The rationale that had once sounded like protection began to echo like rationalization. Meetings she had arranged in order to compress reality around Michael now expanded to expose intent, and the commitment to an outcome shifted into the dread of an inevitable reckoning. Drew met the same wall with a different gate. He had counted on performance and plausible neurology, but the record of rehearsals replaced the alibi of injury with the anatomy of manipulation. The discipline that made the plan orderly now cut against him with the sharpness of timestamp proof. Michael's position changed less like a rescue and more like a tide turning. He still faced questions about why he had allowed a weak alibi to stand and why he had stepped into a hotel room that would always photograph badly in hindsight. Yet the center of gravity moved away from him as the documents illuminated intent elsewhere. He had been playing defense against suspicions that now found a more deserved target. His obligation shifted towards stewardship of his own choices, of a child's bravery, of the knowledge that the person he loved once had attempted to grind him down with a machine built out of bureaucracy and fear. He made himself small in the paperwork because the last thing Scout needed was a story about himself eclipsing the act that had set this course right. Institutions responded the way institutions do, with forms and hearings and a vocabulary that tries to convert moral chaos into administrable units. Hospital ethics reviewed behaviors that intersected with an active investigation. A family court sought to understand the risks children might face in the orbit of someone willing to falsify the world to secure an outcome. Investigators sought additional warrants with an ease earned by the coherence of the evidence, and the devices they collected told the same story at different resolutions, drafts, reminders, calendar invites, a stray note and a voice memo where weariness made the speaker careless. None of it shouted, all of it persisted. The lesson lay not in the crude contrast between innocence and guilt but in the slender lever that moved an elaborate weight. The plan had been built on the assumption that adults control frames and children watch from the bleachers. Yet a single act copying a folder, carrying it to a place where duty live shifted the frame from invention to verification. The cruelty of the scheme was not only in what it sought to do to Michael but in how it asked the world to accept the counterfeit as healing. Willow and Drew believed they were restoring equilibrium by choosing a lie large enough to overpower the truth. They discovered that equilibrium is not restored by weight but by alignment. By the time the dust began to settle, every participant had learned something difficult. Willow learned that a parent's fear can become indistinguishable from control when it stops at nothing. Drew learned that the theater of memory does not fare well against the forensics of time. Michael learned that survival sometimes depends on the quiet courage of someone with no stake but the truth. And the city learned again what it always forgets: complexity is not immunity. Plans can be detailed, and motives can be dressed in care, yet a single unguarded screen can undo months of calculation. The first piece had slid across the board in silence, but the last move belonged to the smallest hand in the room. And it concluded the game not with triumph but with a restoration of order that people had nearly convinced themselves they no longer deserved. Port Charles moved to its own irregular tempo, a city whose rhythms were set by hospital pagers, courthouse calendars, and the quiet churn of rumor that traveled faster than any siren. Curtis stepped into that current with deliberate restraint, taking Martin Gray to Anna to formalize his position before the narrative could harden around him. He did not have the luxury of an airtight alibi, which meant the label of suspect clung like humidity and colored every interaction. Together, they converted anxiety into structure, a documented timeline of Curtis's movements, corroborating records from keycards, service receipts, and surveillance snapshots, a short list of witnesses who could vouch for discrete intervals rather than one implausible block of time. Anna, who had seen too many cases buckle beneath improvisation, insisted on clean chains of custody and a single point of contact for communication so that nothing leaked or contradicted itself. The goal was simple and brutal in its honesty: remove the easy reasons to keep Curtis at the center, and the investigation would be forced outward toward the person who actually deserved it. Portia managed a parallel front with the composure of someone who understood how quickly a family could be pulled into the undertow. She drew a perimeter around Trina's instincts to help, reminding her that decency and procedure are not synonyms, and that good intentions inside an open investigation can read as interference. Schedules were tightened to reduce unplanned appearances, discretionary conversations were postponed, and sensitive communications were routed through counsel. In public, Portia and Curtis stitched a visible picture of stability: shared school drop-offs, overlapping hospital shifts, predictable routineless as theater then as a shield. The appearance of a durable marriage closed off stray lines of speculation that thrived on perceived fractures. It also bought them time, which in a town like this was a currency rarer than cash. On a separate axis entirely, a flight from Croatia delivered more than stamped passports and stale air. Britt woke from a short sleep on Jason's shoulder with resolve hardening into distance. Her return would be cautious, compartmentalized, and unburdened by the kind of nostalgia that blurs judgment. But cities do not care about personal plans. At a cafe, a small crisis unfolded with the suddenness of spilled water. Rocco bolted after a beloved animal, misjudged a turn, and caught a solid edge that left an ugly cut demanding more than a napkin and reassurance. The emergency gathered bodies and urgent Sililu calling ahead. Nina organizing transport, Liesel switching from conversation to triage without changing her tone. By the time they reached General Hospital, the incident had already become a thread in the larger tapestry of the day, and Britt's entrance turned that thread into a seam. Hospitals are built for procedure, yet they are shaped by memory. The moment Britt stepped past the sliding doors, the corridor behaved like a living thing. Heads turned, footsteps paused. Old facts collided with new evidence of survival. Liesel, whose composure had weathered storms that would have ended other people, absorbed the shock as if it were physical, her body punishing her for believing what she had been told. Staff scrambled to balance the immediacy of Rocco's care with the logistical and ethical demands triggered by a return no one had prepared for. Security notified administration because policy required it. Administration notified legal because experience demanded it. Brittany became a catalyst without trying, and the hall outside triage transformed into a grid where unrelated stories briefly overlapped, exchanged heat, and drifted apart, altered by the contact. The investigation moved in counterpoint. Dante adjusted course after encountering Michael and Jacinda in a hotel setting that was almost designed to read badly under fluorescent lights and official questions. The elements of an alibi were present: whereabouts, companionship, receipts, but they had the clumsy edges of a story assembled under stress rather than the accidental coherence of truth. He flagged irregularities and requested records that would test whether the night unfolded as claimed: door logs, hallway camera timestamps, ride-share metadata, and payment histories that either smoothed the story or shredded it. While Dante pressed, Anna handled another fire. Carly, bracing and exact, acknowledged a past threat against Drew that was both incriminating and clarifying. It narrowed motive in one sense and complicated credibility in another, particularly with Brennan hovering in the background as a witness whose reliability was chronically negotiable. Then Jason appeared in Anna's office, not as a headline but as a fulcrum. His presence reweighted every inference and forced a recalibration of how information might move through informal channels. The case board changed in response. Photos shifted, arrows were redrawn, time bands were widened to avoid confirmation bias. Each thread made the others vibrate. Curtis's methodical documentation began to pay off as small verifications accumulated, reducing him from primary focus to a name on the board that required less attention. That adjustment, quiet but decisive, allowed Portia to relax the defensive posture around Trina just enough to feel like a family again rather than a household under siege. At the hospital, Britt's reappearance continued to ripple. Old loyalties were tested in subtle ways: a nurse lingering an extra second before entering her charting password, a surgeon choosing a different route to avoid the corridor where whispers collected, an administrator rewriting a memo to anticipate questions that would arrive before the end of the shift. Even those who claimed indifference found themselves remembering the last time they had seen Britt and what they had felt then. Institutions are supposed to forget people the way rain forgets a street. The body remembers differently. Meanwhile, Dandy's prudence insulated the case from easy collapse. He refused to crown a theory with a trophy of circumstantial proof, preferring a slower build of corroboration that would survive a courtroom's gravity. The Jacinda alibi was treated as a hypothesis, not a conclusion. Brennan's involvement was bracketed, to be tested rather than trusted. Every new artifact was read against a growing ledger of what the city had already taught these investigators: that neat stories are suspicious, that second versions are often closer to the first truth, and that timing is both a weapon and a tell. Anna, in parallel, managed the people around the facts. She kept communication lines narrow, prevented leaks that would contaminate witness recollection, and discouraged the performative urgency that often confuses activity with progress. She also watched the subtle theater of the hospital's response to Britt, understanding that the way an institution metabolizes a shock can hint at where resistances and vulnerabilities hide. By late day, the map of Port Charles looked less like streets and more like pressure systems. There was the pocket around the hospital where surprise had condensed into policy. There was the cooler air around Curtis and Portia's home, where order had been restored not by triumph but by restraint. There was the unstable cell near the hotel, where Dandy's questions had stripped sentiment from logistics and left behind a skeleton of facts waiting for muscle. And there was Anna's office, the eye that did not rest, where threads from every quadrant were braided and tested for strength. The city's rhythm had not evened out. If anything, it had gained new syncopations. Yet the movements contained purpose. The suspect who did not deserve the label was being peeled out from under it. The returning figure who threatened to fracture memory had been absorbed without breaking the institution that received her. The alibi that presented itself as a solution had been demoted to a problem to be solved. Nothing was resolved in the way television promises resolutions, but the day achieved something more useful. It narrowed possibilities without closing the door on what mattered. Curtis could now stand upright without the weight of unfocused suspicion. Portia could recalibrate her protection of Trina from perimeter defense to mentoring about boundaries, a skill that outlasts any investigation. Britt could exist in hallways without becoming a crisis every time her shoe touched tile. Dante could continue his work with the confidence that no one had forced his hand toward an easy answer. And Anna could keep the case moving, fully aware that the next disruption, fresh evidence, a new witness, an unexpected confession will arrive like all the others had. Indifferent to convenience and perfectly timed to test whether the structures they had built were strong enough to hold. From the moment the file was handed over, a chain of verification began to operate. Anna ordered the extraction of traffic camera footage and the mapping of mobile device movements during the critical hours. Dante cross-referenced the call logs of every relevant number, combed through payment receipts, taxi location logs, hotel lobby cameras, and even door sensor data at the hospital. Points that Drew and Willow thought had been buried suddenly revealed sharp outlines, exposing small but fatal contradictions. A call wrongly time-stamped. A location ping accidentally reactivated at just the wrong moment. A hallway clip confirming someone's presence in an entirely different place. Jacinda, once meant to be a lifeline, became a link that proved the attempt to construct a false alibi. While Drew's supposed returning memory was stripped down to nothing more than a deliberate tactic of misdirection. The consequences crashed down on Willow with the merciless logic of a badly played hand. The hospital's ethics committee opened a file to investigate her interference in an active case involving gun violence, while the family court urgently reviewed custody agreements in light of evidence that she had manipulated legal procedures. Her visitation rights were placed under supervision, and psychological evaluations were ordered to measure potential risks in her family interactions. The looks she received from colleagues and acquaintances shifted from sympathy to suspicion, and the image of a grieving mother was replaced by that of a woman willing to bend truth itself for her own ends. Drew was not spared the tightening grip of the law. His bail conditions were made stricter, his access to personal devices temporarily curtailed, and his lawyer forced to confront a digital chain of evidence that could not be brushed aside with rhetoric. Curtis, meanwhile, found partial relief as the weight of suspicion shifted away from him, and Portia and Trina managed to remain at a safe distance, careful not to let their goodwill be twisted into liability. Carly, sharp and unyielding as ever, unexpectedly became a variable in Anna's assessment of Brennan's reliability, exposing the man's reputation for slippery truths. Britt's return continued to stir another layer of emotions, transforming the hospital into both a place of healing and a mirror reflecting the cracks beneath its surface. Liesl pulled herself upright, caught between shock and fragile hope, while the corridors hummed with whispered questions about the price of returning from a fate that was supposed to be final. Jason positioned himself quietly in the middle of these currents, offering no proclamations. But his presence alone reminded everyone that Port Charles rarely forgives manipulation without leaving scars. Michael, who had been placed under suspicion from the very beginning, was unexpectedly pulled back from the brink by the pure, instinctive act of a child. The alibi with Jacinda, already weak, no longer mattered. The exposed plan shifted the scales entirely. From suspect, he became the target of a conspiracy. Dante still pressed him for answers about why he accepted such a flimsy alibi, but the direction of the investigation had turned, and that was enough for Michael to find his footing again. Scout's name was shielded under protections for minors, yet her role was recognized as the small spark that lit up a room full of smoke. By this pause in the storm, storylines converged on the thin border between punishment and warning, and it gained new leverage to push the investigation closer to the real shooter. Dante closed the loop on old suspicions and opened a new one on who stood to profit when truth was bent. Curtis and Portia managed to keep their household intact, while Trina learned the vital lesson that kindness needs boundaries when law is involved. Willow suffered consequences proportionate to her choices, not only in court files but also in the mirror she faced each night. Drew paid the price for confusing manipulation with escape. Michael stepped out of the gray zone, not unblemished but sharper, realizing that justice sometimes begins with the smallest act of courage. And above all, the shadow of Sam Taugon remained a quiet reminder that loss can teach resilience. But it can also push people to forget the line between fighting for survival and falling into ruin if they do not hold fast to the truth.